Hello, welcome to Mapping Global China. Today, we are going to have a conversation with Dr. Haruyama, who is an anthropologist working on China and Africa encounters. So the first question is, could you share a little bit about your academic journey that led you focus on the interactions and encounters between China and Africa? Because this is such an interesting areas of research. And I'm also curious about, are there any particular moments or experiences during your research that defined and solidified this focus?
Yes. So I became interested in the study of Africa when I was an undergraduate student doing my bachelor's degree. So at that time, I was a major in philosophy, and I decided somewhat on a whim in my third year, my junior year of undergraduate, to study abroad in South Africa. I was very interested in post-apartheid racial reconciliation and rural development projects in South Africa. It was through that experience studying abroad in South Africa, I had an opportunity for the first time to be exposed to anthropology and start learning anthropological research methods, which we call ethnography. I lived with a Zulu homestay family during my time there, and I learned to speak isiZulu. And I started doing ethnographic research project with a rural development NGO called the Valley Trust in South Africa, which ultimately contributed to my undergraduate thesis. So through this process, I gained this real fascination, especially with the anthropology of development, going back to classic works like James Ferguson's The Anti-Politics Machine. Then after undergraduate, I joined an American volunteer organization called the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps sends volunteers all around the world for a minimum of 2 years to work on different kinds of development projects. When I joined, I had no idea where I would be sent. I thought maybe I would be sent back to Southern Africa since I had experience there. But in the event, the Peace Corps decided to send me to China, and I ended up spending 3 years in a northwest Chinese province called Gansu Province in a very, very, very small city called Jiangye along the old Silk Road. While there, I learned to speak Mandarin Chinese. I gained more familiarity and appreciation for Chinese culture. So when I came back to the United States, which is my home country, and I started applying for PhD programs in anthropology, I wanted to combine these interests. First of all, in development anthropology, I was really interested in global inequalities and impoverished regions of the world, and what the future might hold for those places, and how people's welfare and well-being might be improved. And then I was especially interested in combining my sort of regional foci in Southern Africa and China, because so much of the anthropology of development to that time, often a critical anthropology of development, had been overwhelmingly about Western development, coming from Europe and from North America, and almost nothing had been done at that time on China's increasing economic investments and economic development projects in Africa, and how that was changing African societies and the well-being of African people. So I thought with my proficiency in Mandarin Chinese and my experience doing ethnographic research in Southern Africa, I could start looking at especially the fine-grained everyday interactions between Chinese and Africans, and start to get an idea of how this might transform African societies, such as that in Zambia, in the coming decades, in what some scholars have referred to as what may be the Chinese century.
This is fascinating. I have to say, I've never been to Gansu province. So it would be an interesting experiences. And also it's a start of the Silk Road, right? So being there and then now working on the Belt and Road Initiative, part of it is such an interesting combination. So I think the country you're primarily working on is Zambia, right? So what drew you to your ethnographic research in Zambia? And what does that context help illuminate China's global engagements? And what type of infrastructure or developments China are developing over there? And what are the differences between, as you've mentioned, between the Western presence over there and China's emergence and China's new kind of rise of influence in this region?
Well, a lot of great questions there. So I'll try to answer the different parts of your questions in sequence. So China has extensive influence. When I say China, I'm referring both to the Chinese state through, for example, its state-owned enterprises and its state-managed, infrastructural loans, for example, as well as private Chinese companies and private individuals who are migrating to Africa. This kind of Chinese influence, both from the state and from private individuals, is now increasingly common and visible pretty much across the breadth of Africa. And you could go to almost any country in sub-Saharan Africa, and this would be a major topic of conversation, for example, with local people. I chose Zambia because Zambia has quite a fascinating history with China. Going way back to the Cold War period in like the 1960s, when Mao Zedong was the leader of China and Kenneth Kaunda was the leader of Zambia. And at that time, Zambia was what was called a frontline state. So what that means is there had been a wave of decolonization coming through Africa. Different former European colonies had gained independence and sovereignty and now had majority rule, where the majority African population was allowed to determine the form of government. But in Southern Africa, the situation was quite different. So into the 1970s, there were still all these what were called white minority regimes. Of course, apartheid South Africa, which people know very well, as well as the Ian Smith regime in Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, and also continuing Portuguese colonialism in Mozambique and Angola. And so Zambia was really surrounded, after it had gotten independence, by all these white minority regimes. So as Zambia was supporting national liberation and supporting organizations like the African National Congress in South Africa, which was based in the Zambian capital of Lusaka for quite a period of time, all these white minority regimes tried to create an economic stranglehold around Zambia. And so Zambia's economy, ever since the British colonial period, has been based on mining, particularly copper mining, and the export of copper. That's where Zambia gets most of its income. And so these white minority regimes refused to let Zambian copper transit through their countries to the ocean. And Zambia is a landlocked country. And so Zambia, the one outlet it had to get to the ocean in a friendly country was Tanzania to the northeast. And so Zambia approached Western countries asking if they would help finance a new railway that would connect Zambia to the ocean through Tanzania. The Western countries refused. They said, this seems like a political endeavor. That's your business. That's no business of ours. And so who stepped in to help China, to help Zambia and Tanzania at that time? It was China. And so China very famously funded this major infrastructure project way back in the 1960s and 70s called the Tazara Freedom Railway that helped create an economic lifeline to Zambia during this very crucial political moment. And so as a result, going back a long time, much earlier than most other African countries, Zambia and China had this very close and friendly relationship that meant that when there was this more recent wave of Chinese migration and investment to Africa in the aftermath of the reform and opening period, Zambia was one of the first destinations for Chinese migrants and investors. And particularly they came in and they invested in the mining industry, though now there's Chinese investments in basically every single part of the Zambian economy. So there are major investments not only in mining, but also in agriculture, in construction, you name it. And there are Chinese people doing that kind of economic activity in Zambia. And then you asked, how does this differ from other foreign investments in Zambia? It differs mostly, I would say, because Chinese investments and investors are willing to insert themselves at many additional scales of the Zambian economy than Western investors usually do. So Western investments are also very loom large in the Zambian economy. So mining, as I said, is the main industry in Zambia, and there are major corporations from, for example, Canada and Switzerland and Australia, the UK that invest in Zambian economy. But they tend to do so in the most profitable and sort of the largest scale areas. Whereas Chinese corporations also do this, especially state-owned enterprises. But then private Chinese investors are willing to do much more sort of small scale economic activities in Zambia that other foreign investors would never consider. So Chinese and Zambia are very famous, for example, like just doing ordinary chicken farming and things like this. And so there's a much greater integration of Chinese investors at all levels of the Zambian economy.
Thank you so much for sharing the history of it. I have no idea what happened over there. And it's fascinating to know that China's presence in Zambia have been over half a century, right? So it's something new for me to know. And also, I'd like to know, it's just a curious question, because back then, and Zambia, they are brothers in struggle together, right? They are poor countries who help each other in this independence movements. But on the other hand, today, the power dynamic, as I see it, has changed because China's economy has boomed over the past 2, 3 decades. And then, as you have said, China has been into at least the both the state power and the private sectors have been integrated in different parts of the economy in Zambia. And you've written about the tensions between the presence of Chinese workers alongside the Zambia locals, right, at the site of those coal mines. So what do you interpret this new power dynamic, this new narrative about China's role in Zambia or in Africa in a larger context, but depending on your preference of take on this question, do you have any anecdotes or examples that could show the change of power dynamics and the new presence of China and how it can figure itself into the local environment?
Yeah, I think thinking historically over the long durée, there's been quite a major ideological shift. Of course, there have been huge ideological shifts within Chinese society over the last half century. And this has really shaped its changing relationships with countries such as Zambia. So, of course, going back to the 1960s, the 1970s, China has always been a much, much larger country in any way of measuring it than Zambia. And so even back in the 1960s and 1970s, China saw itself as a leader that would help guide African countries in sort of this brotherly proletarian struggle against the excesses of colonialist capitalism. But as China has sort of shifted from that earlier Maoist model to, of course, what is described as socialism with Chinese characteristics, but which scholars might refer to as state capitalism. The relationship with Zambia has also changed to be one of mostly capitalist investment rather than anti-colonial solidarity. So whereas historians such as Jamie Monson, who have described, for example, the construction of the Tazara Railway, describe these extremely amicable and egalitarian relationships between Chinese construction workers that came to Africa and the Africans they worked with. Those kinds of amicable and egalitarian relationships were largely not what I found in my research. Instead, as you alluded to in your question, I found much more tense relationships. And so as an example, the main coal mine where I do my research in southern Zambia, I remember the first time I arrived there was in the year 2015. And the mine had just been, it was privately owned by Chinese investors. It had been closed for 2 years by the Zambian government because of alleged labor abuses that were occurring at the mine. The Zambian government had promised to find an alternative buyer for the mine. And then some say because of some political corruption that happened behind the scenes, eventually 2 years later, under a new president, the mine was given back to the same Chinese investors. And so I got there about 1 month after, maybe 2 months after the mine had reopened under the same ownership. And I remember I was there the very first payday that workers were supposed to have. One of the conditions for the reopening of the mine was the Zambian government had required that in addition to Chinese managers, the mine hire at least some Zambian managers. And so there was sort of this emerging integration of the Chinese management staff and the Zambian management staff. So this first month that I was there on payday, there was an angry crowd of Zambian workers, and they came up to the walled compound where the Chinese managers were living. And you have to understand that several years previously at the mine, there had been a labor dispute before where 3 of the Chinese managers had been killed by the workers. So we were quite nervous about what was happening. And fortunately, this time there was a Zambian human resources officer, and she went out and she started talking to the workers. She said, "Look, oh, and I should say the workers were angry because the pay was late. It wasn't there, and they had been promised pay that day." And so she started saying, "Look, I know the pay is late. I've been looking through all the records. I know that the money's going to come in just a couple days. You know, just go home. Like we'll get the pay to you in several days or next week." And then I was talking to her later, and she said she was glad that she was able to go out and do this because otherwise she was pretty sure they were going to jump the wall and start beating the Chinese managers until they released the pay. So this is a mine that has a history of these sort of very tense labor relations. And it's related to a wider perception in Zambian society, as a recent president of Zambia described it, that Chinese are coming as he described in these very xenophobic terms as infestors rather than investors. I think it was the mayor of Lusaka, the national capital, who said that they're practicing a form of slavery reloaded. So this very incendiary rhetoric about Chinese as managers and owners of these businesses in Zambia, and that they're pretty harsh treatment sometimes of Zambian workers, which, as I said, is just this huge ideological shift from what previously was taking place during the construction of, for example, the Tazara Railway.
Interesting. This is such a fascinating anecdote. And also, I'm curious about the racialization, the racial tension between it. On the one hand, I can imagine because the working culture in China, I don't know much about Southern Africa, but I would imagine Chinese people being the hard workers and then they work longer hours. And on the other hand, I think people from other places like Southern Africa, they would definitely have a different working culture over there. So that would be part of the reason, as you have said, maybe behind these conflicts and tensions between Chinese workers, Chinese owners of those factories, coal mines, and also local workers. But on the other hand, are there any other elements like racialized issues behind it that would lead to the escalation of some of these conflicts? And also maybe other economic issues, but I'm curious about the combination of different elements that lead to the anecdote that you witnessed over there.
Yeah, there's quite a number of elements. And so this is a major topic of my research is at sites like this, of course, sometimes, and in fact, most of the time, Zambian workers and Chinese managers will work together, sort of amicably or peacefully. I mean, not very amicably, but well enough that they're able to do the business of mining day after day, month after month, year after year. But then sometimes there are these outbreaks of violence, and so a big topic of my research is why, what causes these kinds of outbreaks of violence, rather. And so one thing that I found regarding, for example, work ethic is absolutely there's a huge perception of Chinese as extremely hard workers in Zambia. And this is not just a negative perception that Zambians have. Actually, many Zambians I spoke with deep admiration about the Chinese work ethic and how many hours they would put in. They did feel that sometimes it was excessive and sometimes they might push their workers too far, especially when it might be backed up with violence, for example. So at the mine that I did research at, it quite famously amongst workers, sometimes the Chinese managers would resort to physical beatings in order to motivate their workers. And so even though many Zambians expressed this real admiration for the Chinese work ethic, but if they cross that line into, for example, using physical beatings to motivate their workers, then for Zambians, that really was beyond the pale. That was too excessive. And of course, we can also think, I don't know, well, listeners may be familiar with the academic work of, for example, like James Scott, thinking about weapons of the weak, which describes how sometimes when people see very little benefit in their incorporation into these capitalist enterprises, for example, if they don't see that their pay is ever going to increase or get any better, then of course they have every reason to sort of go slow and not wear out their physical bodies in the name of building up profits for this mine if they don't feel that it's ever going to lead to benefit for them. And certainly that's something that I saw at the mine. But I also looked at not only these sort of labor and work relations, but wider social and cultural dynamics that sometimes led to tensions or even violence. And so one major topic of my research is on language. So part of my research agenda is to think of Chinese investments in Africa in a historical way, and looking at it as what in the social sciences we sometimes call a palimpsest, which refers to a text that's being overlaid one upon the other. And so when Chinese migration and investment comes to a place like Zambia, it's not coming into a vacuum. There's real histories there that shape the role of Chinese migrants and investors today. And in Zambia, a big part of that history, of course, is the history of British colonialism that lasted until the early 1960s. And so, as is the case in other former British colonies, like Hong Kong or India, for example, in Zambia, the English language is extremely important and held in high regard because of this history of British colonialism. In fact, Zambia has many different ethnic groups as a nation state. It's really a formation of British colonialism that brought all of these different ethnic groups together in a state. And all those ethnic groups, they speak different languages. So there's only one national language of Zambia, and that language is, because of the history of British colonialism, English. And so English is the language that's taught in university, for example. All education pretty much past elementary school is in English. And so English then has symbolic values for many Zambians that associate it with education, that associate it with being high class. And Chinese migrants and investors in Zambia are quite different than investors or expatriates that are coming from other countries, who generally, from other countries, they're generally proficient in English. But most Chinese who come to Zambia have almost no English proficiency at all. So when they come and then they are the owners and managers of a mine, it looks to many Zambians as if they're just coming with no education because they don't speak the language of education, right? And it looks like they have no expertise to be the owners and managers. So a big part of my research is on the way that, for example, these linguistic complaints about the fact that Chinese come in and they don't speak English, and sometimes they don't even have a single translator or interpreter at the mine to interpret with Zambians. These kind of linguistic issues actually become the central crux of Zambian complaints and actually can become this justification for violence, in addition to labor concerns like long working hours or safety conditions and things like that.
This is so interesting. I haven't thought about linguistic issues, but it reminds me of a conversation I had earlier with a global health scholar who spent some time at Republic of Congo. And the Chinese government have donated hospitals over there and sent doctors from my home province, Hebei province, old doctors who are very experienced in their expertise but lack the linguistic skills to communicate with local doctors. So there are also some stories similar to yours in that context too. So I can imagine there is this mismatching of miscommunication because of the lack of linguistic skills. But on the other hand, because you've mentioned the colonial context and the colonial past, that's the origin of the linguistic preference of local people, right, to some extent. So I'd like to know a little bit more about Chinese presence over there because there have been controversies around it. Is it new colonialism or is this a different form of presence? Does it mirror the Western colonialism rooted in the local culture, the linguistic ones, but also the in other parts of the daily lives of local people? Has the Chinese kind of new presence been categorized as colonialism or neo-colonialism according to you? And also, has it been doing some transformations linguistically or culturally or in quotidian life to the local culture and the local context?
Again, a lot of great sub
Mm,
questions there that I will try to answer in turn. So, neo-colonialism and neocolonialism are really interesting terms
mm,
in contemporary China-Africa studies. I would describe them as sort of like boogeymen, and also as like political footballs that get thrown around sort of willy-nilly sometimes, and has resulted in an extremely polarized and polemical debate both outside of academia and inside of it. And so, especially outside of academia, you often see this completely like just binary, especially Western politicians and media outlets, but also many African politicians and media outlets are really likely to use this frame of colonialism and neocolonialism to describe Chinese involvement in Africa today. I've mentioned like the mayor of Lusaka was describing it as slavery reloaded, for example. And then on the other side, you have more of an apologist camp for China that really especially draws connections to this earlier third world solidarity from the Mao years to say that no, this is South-South cooperation and friendship. It's non-exploitative. It doesn't have any of these colonial aspects. Then in academia, then some scholars have been very sort of reticent to address this issue, precisely because of the very politicized role that it's played. In my own work, I attempt to engage with these questions of colonialism and in academia, what we sometimes call racial capitalism, but to do it in a very ethnographic way and to see that the way that, for example, my interlocutors, the people I do research with in Zambia, describe it. So again, here, I think it's important to emphasize the way that history operates as this palimpsest that I described. And so the way that contemporary Chinese migration and investment is not coming in a vacuum. To give you a bit more historical context on Zambia, I've described some of the ideological shifts that have happened in China since the early days of Sino-Zambian friendship. But important shifts also were happening in Zambia over that period. So after Zambia got independence under its first president, Kenneth Kaunda, who's really considered sort of the builder of the nation, Zambia took all of the mines that were owned by these major colonial mining corporations called Anglo-American and the Rhodesian Selection Trust, And it said, okay, we're going to buy these mines out from you because as part of our national independence, we don't want our main industry under the power of these foreign colonial mining corporations. We want our mining industry under the control of Zambians. And so they eventually bought out Anglo-American and the Rhodesian Selection Trust, and they nationalized the mines. And so for quite a number of decades, the mines were owned by the Zambian government for a few decades. But then the price of copper crashed, and this is in the 1980s. And because copper was the main source of the Zambian government's foreign exchange reserves, suddenly the Zambian government had a lot of trouble paying off its debts. And so it approached the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, asking for some help in restructuring its loans so that it could continue making these debt service payments. And in what is sometimes called the Washington Consensus or neoliberalism, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, they said, sure, we'll help you, but with conditions. Conditions are called structural adjustment. And they said, we have a certain idea of how you should manage your economy, which is economic liberalization. Part of this means we want you to denationalize all of your mines and sell them back to private corporations. And so the Zambian government was forced to sell off its mines at really, bargain basement prices. What that led to was a situation in which, again, as during the colonial period before Zambia got independence, the entire Zambian mining industry, which is, again, its main industry, came under the control of foreign corporations. And so now, once again, no large mine in Zambia is owned by Zambians. They're all owned by these foreign corporations. So Chinese firms came in and bought mines in Zambia, both large mines, some of the largest mines, and also small mines, but also all these other foreign corporations came in. And so in my work, I look back to the original definition of neocolonialism, which was defined by the Ghanaian independence leader, Kwame Nkrumah. And so he has a book called Neocolonialism. So the way that Nkrumah describes neocolonialism is quite different from colonialism. Colonialism involved, formal political sovereign control by the colonial power over their colonies. Right? And so Nkrumah says, well, in a place like Ghana, after Ghana got independence, it was the first Anglophone country to get independence in Africa. It's not so much that the British still had formal political sovereignty. It's that through through multinational corporations, they controlled the Ghanaian economy and therefore were able to completely influence Ghanaian independence and Ghanaian political decisions, right? And it's through the control of these multinational corporations. And so in my work, I show the way that certainly it's very different from colonialism in terms of political sovereignty, but in terms of how Kwame Nkrumah defined neocolonialism, China is certainly part of this neo-colonial process in Zambia, but only one of quite a number of foreign powers that have this neo-colonial control and influence over Zambia. So in this way, whereas once during the Mao years, China was really adopting this anti-colonial stance and really started to destabilize the world order. Instead, I and a number of other scholars show these days how China is increasingly trying to insert itself into the existing world order rather than reshaping it. And it seeks to insert itself and to put itself at the top. But thus far, and again, if this will be a Chinese century, the outcomes are still uncertain. But for now, it doesn't seem like the Chinese state or private Chinese capital is in any way reshaping this economic system that characterizes Zambia's place in the wider global economy.
So illuminating for me, especially tracing back to the transformation to the neoliberal mind in reshaping the economic structure of these countries. And another question that I have following up on this historical and fascinating answer is the Belt and Road Initiative. Is Belt and Road Initiative at least an attempt or imaginary attempt in reshaping something? And has it taken different shape in the infrastructure management and development in South Africa, in the places you're familiar with? And also, I'd like to know the whole kind of a Belt and Road Initiative type of narrative, has it kind of changed some of the existing structure, as you have just said, China inserting itself and being the leader in this existing system? Or has it, the Belt and Road Initiative, at least tried to tell a different story, but maybe in practice it doesn't take that shape. But on the other hand, narratively, in narrative, it tries to do something. I'd like to know your understanding and interpretation of the Belt and Road Initiative and China's kind of infrastructural and development over there.
I think that's a really fantastic question. Uh, Raises quite a number of interesting points. I certainly agree with you. I think it is an attempt to create a new narrative. But as other scholars have pointed out, it's hard to see sometimes because the Belt and Road is actually such a diffuse phenomenon. So it involves so many different kinds of discrete projects
Mm.
and discrete pledges that it's not always clear like how much substance there is to these different individual pledges. And then all of these very discrete projects and discrete pledges are brought together under one super narrative
Mm.
of the Belt and Road. But the connections between that as narrative and rhetoric and what is actually happening are not always totally clear. So certainly, I think there is this rhetorical strategy and this rhetorical narrative of sort of reframing what the global economy might look like. And I mean, another major place we see this playing out, of course, is the BRICS grouping,
Mm.
which is to sort of reimagine the global economy as not centered around the Euro-American West, which it certainly was for the last couple centuries before our own. I would say that because my work very intentionally is geared towards like the everyday and the quotidian
Mm.
that you're making reference to. In that way, actually, the Belt and Road Initiative as this super narrative recedes from view. It is this sort of meta framing device, but actually doesn't have, at least in my field sites, which are not sort of the signature infrastructure developments of the
Mm.
Belt and Road. It doesn't have that much interaction in daily life between Chinese and Zambians. In fact, I think most of the Zambians that I know, in fact, even most of the Chinese migrants that I do research with are only vaguely even aware of the Belt and Road Initiative. It just doesn't really impact their daily lives or their daily interactions. So in that way, I think um, the Belt and Road has huge sway amongst various like policy and governing elites, and of course, as a major rhetorical and narrative strategy, it would and it would help shape their views there. But my ethnographic research demonstrates that that kind of narrative may not sort of filter through and have so much impact on
Mm.
the finer grained interactions
Mm.
between, for example, Chinese and Zambians at coal mining sites in southern Zambia.
Yeah, that this is a really interesting. I haven't thought about it because I know it's a umbrella term. It has so many elements in it, which makes it difficult to define. But on the other hand, because of this grandiose kind of structure and narrative around it, it is hard for us to have it filter into the daily lives of local people. So it would have limited impact maybe when we do this type of research. And on the other hand, I'm curious about your vision of it. What alternative frameworks in your mind would be a better way to deal with this inequalities, global inequalities, especially when you work on South Africa and then Southern Africa? And also, how do we address these disparities, these narratives, which is beautiful, but on the other hand, in practice, it's hard to really change things for the local people and in the local context. So what are the alternatives you have in mind, and will your research inform you of some new ideas and directions that we could follow?
So my long academic and intellectual journey, which I addressed in your first question, sort of goes back to this engagement with the anthropology of development. And so many historians of development would trace the sort of contemporary idea of development that we have to the aftermath of World War II. There's a very famous speech that Harry Truman gave, I think in like 1949, where he sort of outlines the US's commitment to this new development project. And it was a way of understanding sort of how the world was going to be organized in the aftermath of colonialism. So the US aspired to be this anti-colonial power, or at least sort of breaking down the formal colonialism that European powers had. And so as all of these new countries throughout what would become called the Global South were gaining independence, it was clear that there were these colossal economic disparities left over from the end of colonialism. And that in the case of Zambia, for example, and this is where we start getting world systems theory that thinks about the world, the global economy in sort of global class structure of core, semi-periphery, and periphery. And so Zambia as a periphery nation is fundamental to the global economy, producing copper and exporting it globally, just as like next door, for example, the Democratic Republic of the Congo produces coltan, which is extremely important mineral that gets used in all our phones and computers and other digital technology. So these countries are crucial to the functioning of the global economy, but are incorporated into that global economy on very unequal terms. And see very few benefits for their own people and their own citizens. I'm very interested in my work with these questions that anthropologists of development have grappled with. So it's been about 75 years, three-quarters of a century since sort of this development project has been initiated. And 75 years later, huge global inequalities still exist. The world is still structured in this core semi-periphery way, and countries like Zambia and Democratic Republic of the Congo continue to be extremely unequally incorporated into that. And so, if conventional development initiatives in places like Africa have not really succeeded, what other thinking outside of the box interventions might make a big difference? And so one big aspect that comes from my research and my conversations with Zambian people and my observation of long-term life stories and looking at what really allows Zambians to make a big difference in their lives is thinking about freedom of mobility. And so without a doubt, for Chinese and many of the Chinese who come to Zambia are quite working class Chinese people. For working class Chinese and Zambians alike, one of the best routes to economic advancement, to economic development, is being able to freely move around the world and to migrate somewhere else and take up economic opportunities somewhere else. And then those economic resources can be brought back to their countries of origin. We see throughout the world, especially in Western countries, increasing barriers being put up to migration, which in some of my work, I argue in in a relatively radical vein, is sort of a hoarding and safeguarding of wealth that was generated
Mm,
from centuries of colonial relations.
mm,
And now that that wealth has been accumulated and hoarded in what we call the global north, now global north countries are setting up these barriers and say, well, we're just going to hold on to this, and no
mm,
one is allowed to come here. But I think that instead allowing for more freedom of mobility and not forcing people to be embedded in a single place
mm,
actually offers one of the most promising avenues
mm.
towards economic development and lessening global inequalities in the coming decades and century.
Well, thank you so much. From what I learned from this illuminating conversation, on the one hand, I learned a lot from the concept of palimpsest, the layers of histories to understand the local issues. I think it is really important because it's part of the rootedness, right? We need to understand the history, the roots of these problems and of these people in order to solve some of the inequalities and the problems that we face today. And on the other hand, it's the rods, right? It's the mobility, it's the movements of labor and also of people who could travel to other places to enjoy the fruits of the unequal structures of modern economy, right? So that's something really interesting, and a combination of the rootedness, the roots, and also the routes, the mobility of it. So this is a great way of looking at these issues, and looking ahead, because we've been digging into the past and also talking about the present. But in the future, if you could design a next project to understand global China, but also Southern Africa, what would it look like, and what type of areas, stories, or voices you think are still underrepresented and underexplored that you want to bring out in the future?
One major avenue that I am developing my research in is considering more of the religious
Mm,
relations between Chinese and Africans, and the way that a religion undergirds and informs a lot of these everyday encounters. In this sense, I'm trying to move against a little bit what we might describe as a maybe a secular bias in a lot of the social sciences. Many, certainly not all, but many social scientists come from quite secular backgrounds, and I think that can lead to blind spots
mm,
when secular social scientists come to a place like Zambia. Zambia is a deeply, deeply religious country. Most people in Zambia, their relationship with God and religion is fundamental to their
mm,
identities. And social scientists might treat that as sort of epiphenomena, as
mm,
not very serious to the actual social dynamics
mm,
that they think are important. But I think as an anthropologist, I think that this can be a mistake because it means imposing our own categories
mm,
and what we think is important, rather than taking seriously what people in these field sites themselves are saying is important. So I've been looking more at these kinds of religious connections. For example, I have been doing research with communities of Zambian Christians who, out of their commitment to God, they become fluent in Mandarin Chinese,
ah,
and they hold their meetings exclusively in Mandarin Chinese. So a congregation entirely of Zambians, or 99% Zambians, and from beginning to end, they won't speak any language except Mandarin Chinese in their religious meetings. And they start eating Chinese food, and they start developing all this other appreciation for Chinese culture. And this is a huge change,
mm,
as would be clear from my earliest answers, from the otherwise quite xenophobic or antagonistic relations that often exist between Zambians and Chinese. So I'm interested in tracing the ways that religious commitment can result in quite different kinds of contemporary Africa-China relations.
Interesting. I can't wait to read more about this research. And my final question is about a book that you would like to recommend for the listeners who are interested in global China, but also interested in China and Africa encounters and relationships. Which would be the book for a layman like me to read for starters?
Can I recommend three books?
Yeah, definitely.
I'm going to recommend three great ethnographies
Mm,
that have come out in recent years that trace these sort of everyday quotidian interactions from different angles between Africans and Chinese. So the first is Affective Encounters by Di Wu. The second is The Spectre of Global China by C.K. Lee. And then the third is Reconfiguring Racial Capitalism by Mingwei Huang.
okay, thank you so much. I'll put it in the show notes so that our listeners could get the chance to read them. Thank you so much, Dr. Haruyama. This is a fascinating topic, and also I'm looking forward to reading your articles and books in these really, really interesting research topics. And thank you so much for spending your time with us today. Thanks.
Fantastic. It was a pleasure.